Morning, everyone. You're all here with us and we appreciate it. My name is Leanne and I am a business development executive here at Clyso. This is our first webinar in our Meet the Expert series, so we're very excited about this. We'll plan to do a webinar each quarter for you that will cover a variety of Ceph topics. And I just want to highlight a few things before Mark gets going. We are utilizing the Q&A feature for this, so please feel free to enter your questions throughout the presentation. You all have the power to vote on questions that you feel are most valuable, and then at the end, we'll quickly go through those in the Q&A portion after the presentation. And then you can also expect a follow-up email from me after this that'll just give some more information on where you can access any of the presentation recording or presentation material. So just keep your eyes peeled for that. I'll send an email through. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce you all to Mark Nelson. He is the head of research and development here at Clyso, and he's the performance lead for the upstream project and doing magical things for the community and for us. So he will walk us through his journey to 1 terabyte. Mark, this is all you. Take the stage.
Well, thank you, Leanne. Okay, hey guys, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. So here I am. I'm gonna actually turn my camera off just so it's not like weird and distracting. So this project, let me kind of just give an introduction on this. This was both one of the most stressful and one of the most fun things I've ever done with Ceph. This was an incredible experience, and I'm really excited to talk to you about it. The thing that really made all of this possible was we had a really great customer to work with on this. We started working with them in the fall of last year. And they came to us and basically had an existing Ceph cluster with hard drives that wasn't really meeting their needs anymore. The performance wasn't what they needed to be for their use case. They wanted to grow the storage space fairly significantly. So they were looking at basically building out a completely NVMe-based deployment. They had already put in place a very fast 100 gig network. I probably can't go too much into their network configuration, and we didn't have a hand in setting any of that up. But I'll just say that it was set up very well, and they had a lot of bisection bandwidth across the entire network. So at no time was that a bottleneck for us. It was very nice. The other thing that was really great about this customer is that they had an idea for kind of what they wanted, but when they came to us, they hadn't purchased anything yet. So this is like a dream whenever you have a customer that's asking questions, but kind of lets you work with them to give recommendations, and they listened to us, which was really exciting too. So they did have a couple of constraints that we had to work within. The hardware pretty much had to be Dell. They're a big Dell shop, and it kind of just made the most sense for them. Dell hardware is great, but it's a little bit more limited in terms of the selection than certain other vendors. And you'll see kind of later on what I mean. But yeah, so that was one constraint we had to work in. They had a large number of racks, 17 racks to work with, but only 4 U of space per rack. So that's great from the standpoint that we have a lot of racks to use in terms of failure domains, but it was just a little bit tricky in some ways. They had also a kind of a maximum power limit per rack, which initially we thought was around 1,000 watts, but after kind of digging into it more, they had closer to about 1,500 watts of budget, which it's fine. It would end up not being a problem at all, but that was definitely one constraint we were very aware of. And then the other really big one is that they wanted to basically be able to do this hardware replacement in place. They didn't want the existing cluster to be impacted while we basically kind of retrofitted the whole thing. So that will also come up later, but that was something we were very aware of from the very beginning. So to start all of this off, the very, very first thing we did when we were talking to them was basically design how the hardware architecture should look for this thing. This is fairly well known, I think, already, but I'll just kind of go over it for people. If you want to build really fast Ceph nodes based on NVMe drives, there are some constraints that you should kind of keep in mind. It's not usually a good idea from a performance perspective to put too many NVMe drives in one node. 10 to 12 is reasonable from a kind of cost and performance standpoint. That's a good middle ground, and there's a lot of different 1U nodes from different vendors out there that that will take 10 to 12 drives. So that's not a bad way to go. If you're really shooting for kind of the maximum performance, you can actually drop that down to more like 6 to 8. It depends on the CPU architecture you're using and a couple of other factors, but this is where we tend to see like the number of IOPS that you can achieve in one node kind of starting to plateau. It depends on the kind of NVMe drives. It depends on a lot of different things, but we've seen this across multiple different architectures. It's pretty common. So the general advice here is that if you're going to target performance, more nodes are usually better than fewer nodes. That might change as you get up into huge numbers of nodes, but for kind of typical scale, this is generally a decent rule of thumb. We choose single socket nodes over dual socket nodes to reduce complexity. At times it can be a good idea to use multi-socket nodes. Potentially if you're like targeting hyperconverged, it might be a good idea, but single socket nodes are just a lot easier to work with. You don't have to do any kind of NUMA pinning. It's generally a much easier setup to try to optimize. So we prefer it. Doesn't mean you can't go the other way. Doesn't mean that you can't like do a dual socket configuration for some things, but that's just been our experience, is that it's easier this way. And we tend to be pretty generous with the amount of CPU cores. I won't get into it in this presentation a whole lot. We've got a couple of papers up on the Ceph.io site and blog articles and things where you can kind of look at how we scale with CPU cores. But especially for this cluster where performance was a consideration, the cost of nodes like this are dominated by the NVMe drives. Jumping up and being a little bit more generous on the CPU is maybe like a 2% overhead. So in our mind it's worth it usually, even if you're maybe erring on the side of having a little bit too much. So one of the things that I don't think has ever really been talked about before, short of the performance meeting last week, which some of you might have been at, no one's really looked at how Ceph utilizes the memory bandwidth in a node, how much it consumes to do the I/O that it does. We know it's high. We've known it's been high for a while, but we've never really either been able to or taken the time to really measure it. So recently we did, and what we saw was fairly amazing to me. What you're seeing here is basically for a given read or write, how much amplification we're seeing in terms of memory bandwidth for that. So if we're doing like a 4 megabyte read, we're actually seeing like almost 24 megabytes of memory bandwidth per second consumed for 4 megabytes per second of reads, and the same for these other things. Reads are really the ones that kind of are affected by this the most, because we're fastest at large sequential reads. You can see though that like for 4K random writes, the amplification is huge. On the OSD side, it's like 63x. So we use a lot of memory throughput to do our work in Ceph. The most surprising one to me actually was not that 63x number, which is big, but I figured it wasn't going to be great. It's actually on the client side for these 4 megabyte reads. We have an 8x multiplier for memory bandwidth on the client side when doing reads. I don't know why. We know that we'll do some in copying memory out of the kernel. We know that we'll be doing some for checksums and other things, but 8x seems incredibly big. I talked to Ilya a little bit about it. He really didn't know either. He had no idea. So this is still a little bit of a mystery, but it's quite crazy. So on these nodes, we've actually got well, actually, I haven't gone over, I guess, the full hardware list, but assuming that we want to hit 20 gigabytes per second, maximizing dual 100 gig. On the OSD side, we need about 114 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. If you're co-locating the clients, though, on the same nodes as the OSDs, that jumps up into like, between probably like 250 and 275. That's huge, right? Like on very, very modern processors, you have that much. But even on like last gen Rome processors with DDR4 memory, single socket, I think it's like 204 that you get, 204 gigabytes per second. And that's like maximum, assuming that you get the full throughput of all channels. So this is actually like a really big deal. We're probably hitting memory limits, memory bandwidth limits for the read case, especially if you're trying to do some kind of like hyperconverged setup. And that actually might be a case where you really actually benefit from having dual sockets, because then you have twice as much memory bandwidth. And if you're good about NUMA pinning and doing all these crazy things, you might actually get close to the double the throughput. So yeah, it's really, really crazy. Okay, so going on now, I'll actually talk about the hardware config here. This is the design that we came up for these guys. 68 of the Dell PowerEdge R6615 chassis. These are 1U 10 NVMe chassis. We're using the most recent AMD technology here, 48 cores, 96 threads. I think these processors are 2.75 gigahertz base, if I remember right. 192 gigabytes of DDR5 memory, and here AMD has really made this fast. You get 12 channels of this stuff, theoretically up to 460 gigabytes per second. So well above what theoretically we can hit, but still in practice, we might actually be getting somewhat close to hitting certain limits here. Let's see, standard dual 100 gig Mellanox ConnectX 6 cards. These things are great. We've been using them for quite some time. Dell does not give you a whole lot of options regarding their NVMe drives. These are their standard 15.36 terabyte read intensive drives. They're fine. We're not super worried in this case about the number of writes going into this cluster. It's a fairly mixed workload. So yes, they'll be just fine. In reality, those are actually Samsung drives under the hood. They're PM1733s. Well, I might get into that a little bit more later, but just thought I'd mention it. And we're using Ubuntu, an older version of Ubuntu. This is just what they're using in-house. No particular reason to use this over 2204. It's just because that's what they're deploying everywhere, and they'll probably upgrade at some point. We are using Quincy, though. For this testing, it's actually using the upstream Debian packages, and that turned out to be very relevant. So the rough plan for this whole thing was we wanted to upgrade the existing cluster to Quincy, basically get it ready to match what we're going to deploy the new hardware with. Next, the customer will set up and deploy and image the nodes the way they want. We weren't hired to do any of the actual hardware deployment or anything like that. But once that was in place, we did run some basic hardware tests, made sure the network looked good, made sure the drives looked good, that kind of thing. Step 3 was to install CPT. That's the upstream Ceph benchmarking toolkit, basically, where we can do kind of repeatable performance testing, redeploy clusters very quickly and very easily, and run tests over and over again. And then finally, basically redeploy all this new hardware as OSDs for the existing cluster and migrate all the data into the new OSDs. So phase 1 and 2 were both very, very fast and looked great. One of my colleagues, TiB, upgraded the existing cluster without issue. I think he just got done in maybe a day or two. It was very fast. The customer deployed all the new hardware. There was a slight glitch in their tooling. Instead of deploying to the OS to the BOS drives, which are basically just M2 drives on a riser card that Dell does. The OS got placed on a couple of the OSD drives, so we only had 8 to work with for the initial testing instead of 10. And these basic tests looked good. Network looked good. NVMe drives looked good. I put on here these fateful words. What could go wrong, right? I think all of us have been there at some point. So yeah, we did some initial validation testing. The goal here was to actually compare against what's been published on Ceph.io for the upstream lab. We actually have in the upstream lab the previous generation of Dell hardware using the older Rome processors, and have quite a bit of data on that setup. Originally, it was supposed to be a 30 drive versus 30 drive comparison, but since we only had 8 drives per node instead of 10, it ended up being 24 drives for the customer versus 30 drives for the upstream lab. We also have more density on this customer deployment. So it was 3 nodes versus 5 nodes. So this isn't exactly apples to apples here. But having said that, it gave us something to work with to see if we're in the same ballpark kind of level of performance that we wanted to be. And sadly, we were not. The initial tests looked pretty awful. I put on the side. This phase 3A. It wasn't just phase 3. We ended up having to break it up into multiple parts. So as you can see here, we're low basically in these 4 corners testing that we did in every corner. Both sequential reads and writes were bad, and probably the best looking thing here was random read IOPS, but even that was like half of what the upstream lab was doing with fewer nodes. More drives, but fewer nodes. So yeah, this was not great. So you can probably see all of the pain and suffering in the paper. If you haven't seen the paper yet, I'll have it at the end, the links to it at the end. But yeah, we went through probably about 2 weeks of pain and suffering trying to figure out what the heck was going on here. We did more raw hardware testing and a lot of single OSD testing, or single node testing as the case might be. And we saw really, really bizarre behavior, really inconsistent performance. It took some time to find the patterns and what was going on, but especially initially it was just kind of chaos. So we ended up going through a number of false leads on this. The most promising looking thing for a while was CPU thermal throttling. These nodes actually, under load, we were seeing the CPU get up to about 95 degrees Celsius, which is not quite at the throttling level. I think it's 100, but we're really, really close. I think we were even above 95. I think we might have even been up to 96 or 97 on a couple of the CCX nodes. But in the end, this was incorrect. That wasn't what the problem was. So without kind of going into too much detail here, since we cover it in the paper, there were 3 fixes that really helped quite a bit. The first is an easy one. It's something that we've known about for a long time. Anyone that's come to the performance meetings over the last 5 years have probably heard this come up at one point or another. The first thing is to disable C states in the BIOS, or via something like TuneD. That helps with small I/O performance quite a bit. Any kind of C state transitions, both on Intel and now we've verified on AMD processors, really can impact IOPS and latency. So disabling C states is a very easy and quick, good fix. The next one, this is actually probably was the most important fix out of all of these, and it's the customer that figured this one out. On these nodes, for whatever reason, having IOMMU enabled causes the kernel to end up in spin lock, spending a lot of time in spin lock, and it's not totally clear why. I have reached out to AMD on this. We talked briefly to Dell about this. No one seems to have any real good idea of why this is happening. So if any of you have really good contacts at AMD, please feel free to message me after this is all done. I'd love to hear from you, because we still haven't figured this out. But having said that, the customer had actually seen this before with their application on other nodes that they have. So they kind of had a little bit of a hint that this is somewhere they should look. And when they were, I set up basically a parallel test environment for them to do their own Ceph testing with, and they had done some examination with perf, saw that the kernel was spending a lot of time in spin locks with IOMMU, and that kind of then tipped them off that they were hitting the same problem that they saw before. So yeah, I'm almost a little embarrassed that they figured it out before we did, but that's sometimes that happens. So we redeemed ourselves a little bit though, because we were still seeing lower than expected IOPS, and it looked a lot like some issues I had seen before, where Ceph wasn't being compiled with or where Ceph was basically not being compiled as a release build. It was being compiled with debug flags enabled. So I went back and did a bunch of investigation in the upstream build process and figured out that, in fact, all of the Ceph Debian and Ubuntu builds were compiling RocksDB in debug mode. And that was both causing a big performance impact, and was also for IOPS, and was also making compactions take about 3 times longer than they should have been. So after all this was done, you can see it was much better. Interestingly, not always better than the upstream lab, but we were still running with 24 drives instead of 30. So it's at least was in the right ballpark. We could have maybe tried to keep going with some of this, but we were basically about a week behind where we wanted to be in terms of getting this all done, and they were happy with it, and we were fairly happy with it at this point. At least we were happy enough that it was in the right ballpark. The other thing that we saw that was very interesting here is that we think that the drives, even though these are actually slightly better drives than the upstream lab, they're PM1733s instead of Samsung PM893s, enterprise versus data center class drives. The PM893s appear that they might actually be a little bit faster for IOPS, at least initially. So it's not totally clear what's going on there. Dell firmware versus Samsung firmware, different drive model. Don't know for sure, but it's actually quite possible that those data center class drives might, for some reason, be a little bit faster. Okay, but overall, right ballpark, way better than we were before. Okay, so this took us pretty much to winter break. The customer at this point wanted to get all the fixes in place as part of their image deployment process, and fix the boot drive issue so that we could have all 10 NVMe drives per node used. I was planning on taking a vacation, which I desperately needed at that point. And you know, everyone was kind of taking off for the holidays anyway. So we basically took a break until the new year. So I came back all ready to go and get this testing done. And I came back on the new year, and one of our other customers was suffering from a critical outage where their production infrastructure was down. So unfortunately, whereas I was expecting to basically have all week to wrap this up and be done on Friday, I didn't actually get started on doing any of this additional testing until Friday, and managed to convince the customer to give us an extra day on Monday to wrap it up. So you know, up until this point, we had just been doing small scale tests, like, you know, 1 OSD, 1 node, 3 OSDs, or three nodes, that kind of thing. But we really wanted to verify that this whole cluster was actually, you know, capable of you know, hitting good performance at scale. That was the whole point of doing this kind of advanced testing. So luckily, our luck basically changed at this point. You know, we've been through a lot of pain and suffering. We just dealt with a major different critical outage for another customer. Everything was a little rough up until that point. But on Friday, I ran our 30 OSD tests, which, you know, basically was 3 nodes, similar to what we've been doing before, and it looked good. I was glad to see that. Ran 100 OSD tests, not 30 node, 30 OSD. Ran 100 OSD tests. That scaled pretty well. Then I bumped it up to 320 OSDs, so basically 32 nodes, and I saw really, really good scaling. It was, I've got to tell you guys, it was the best feeling in the world to see this. And we were hitting over 600 gigabytes per second for sequential reads. So this was only with about half of the OSDs in the cluster, by the way. To do more though, I was using half of it for OSDs and half of it as client nodes. But to be able to like take this further, I had to put the FIO clients on the same nodes as the OSDs. We didn't have any separate client nodes to test with. And as I kind of mentioned before, that's when we start to see memory bandwidth actually becoming like a really big issue. We're not at the theoretical limits, but we're actually pushing pretty hard on memory at that point. So we basically ran a whole bunch of tests over the weekend. Took the whole weekend to just try to see what we could get. One of the very interesting things that we hit is at scale, especially as we scaled up the number of FIO clients that we had co-located with the OSDs, we started seeing PGs going laggy. And when PGs go laggy, it actually blocks writes. So we had to try to work around that to some degree. The biggest thing that helped was actually reducing the number of FIO clients down. We don't have a fix for this yet. As far as I know, this is still present in Ceph. It's something that I've talked to Radek about a couple of times, but we do need to investigate this and figure out what's going on. So I had, throughout this testing, had the goal that I really wanted to hit a terabyte per second on this cluster. That was kind of the from the very first days that I was talking to the customer. I was like, I think I can hit a terabyte per second on this. Did we do it? We did, in fact. These are the best numbers that we got. They weren't necessarily with the same settings for all of these, so I want to point that out. The reason I'm presenting it this way is because we were working around this laggy PG issue. I think Ceph is actually perfectly capable in this cluster of hitting all of these at the same time with the same settings. But right now, this laggy PG problem that we hit basically was tanking write performance when you optimize for read performance. So just be aware that that's what we're showing you here. We could hit this write throughput when we drop the number of FIO clients down. We could hit that kind of read throughput when we hit the number of FIO clients up. we did a whole bunch of testing with different numbers of like async messenger threads and TPOSD, TP threads and everything. A fair amount of that is in the paper, so you can look at that if you're really interested in the details, or you can talk to me. That's fine too. But these are the best numbers we got. So we did hit a terabyte per second for reads, over a terabyte per second for reads actually. It's easier than saying TiB. Oh boy. I don't know if I can say it, so whatever. We hit like over 270 gigabytes per second for 4 megabyte writes with 3x replication, and well, everything else you can see it here. Lots, millions upon millions of IOPS, both for reads and writes. Erasure coding was interesting. The customer is deploying in an erasure coding configuration. So while the 3x replication results are really fun because we actually hit that big number that we wanted, this is actually closer to what they're really running in practice. We could do 550 gigabytes over roughly 550 gigabytes per second, more than we could for replication for writes. That's like 390 gigabytes per second. And that makes sense, right? Because you're actually transferring less data over the network. With 3x replication, you're actually writing out 3 replicas for 6+2. You're writing out less. And I'll have to remember the math on top of my head. I won't do it. But that's why we see that doing better for the erasure coding case. IOPS, of course, is hit quite a bit when you do erasure coding. We know that it is the way it is right now. There is some work that we started doing at Clyso that Radek at IBM has taken over to do basically partial reads for erasure coding. And I expect that when we merge that, this cluster could probably do closer to 12 to 15 million IOPS for 4K random reads. That work is getting pretty close to being done. In fact, I think I owe Radek some review and testing on his version of it. So yeah, it's very exciting work. And I need to mention too that work originally came from a contributor in China. I don't remember his name off the top of my head. I apologize. But I didn't write the initial version of that. Nor did anyone that was working on Ceph. That was an external contribution. So I just want to make sure that he gets credit for that. It was really exciting, and we kind of overlooked it when it was submitted about 5 years ago, but we're getting it in now, so it'll be really, really good. The other thing that I wanted to highlight here, and this isn't something that I really discussed a whole lot in the paper, but I wanted to highlight for you guys here, is that we saw really, really good scaling on this cluster. We're basically at the limit of dual 100 gig Ethernet for these like 30 and 100 OSD tests, and even pretty close for the 320 OSD tests. We're sitting at right around 20 to 21 gigabytes per second. So it's very, very exciting. These are big numbers, and it scaled really well. Now, once we jumped up to 630 OSDs, it dropped down. But this is when we're running FIO on the same systems as the OSDs, and we know that we've got that's really, really hammering on the memory, all of those memory channels, and really hammering them hard. So we don't know if that was the cause for why we saw this kind of big drop here, but I suspect that it might be related. I have seen in other contexts where if I can move FIO off the OSD nodes, I see pretty big jumps in performance, even at small scale. So I think it might be related. I'm hoping that we can do more investigation on this down the road, but yeah, I think some of the pieces are starting to kind of come together here. And my hope is that we can really dig into both the messenger code and anything else on the client side or the OSD side that might be consuming a lot of memory bandwidth, and make these numbers a little bit better. Scaling on 4 megabyte writes was not bad. We did degrade more as the number of OSDs increased. Interestingly here, it really, there was no difference between 320 and 630 OSDs, so maybe we're actually plateauing, not sure. Didn't have time to really dig into it more than this, unfortunately. We did see that there was a fairly, there was some drop for 4K random reads on a per node basis. This, interestingly enough, is very similar to what we've seen on other nodes at small scale, or at small scale. We tend to not do much better than about 600 to 700,000 IOPS per node. And this is pretty consistent. Sometimes it's less, but that's where we tend to top out at. And everything that I've seen so far has indicated that this is basically related to the messenger threads and interaction with the kernel, the TCP stack in the kernel. We spend a lot of time waiting on send message and receive, and those messenger threads basically are sitting waiting on that, maybe going off and doing some other work for CRC calculations or other things, maybe trying to put data into the TPOS DTP thread queues. But really, it seems like it's that kernel level interaction that's really maybe limiting us there. So that is also something that I'm trying to dig into and look into more, and seeing if there's something that we could do there, maybe having a separate thread that's their only job is to basically spin looking at the kernel. We'll see. Okay, random write IOPS, it was pretty consistent. I think we've seen better per node numbers than these in the past with smaller scale, but I'd have to go back and check again. But it's not quite as bad as it looks, right? Because we're doing 3x replication, so it's really like 3 times these numbers that are actually hitting the OSDs, but it's still definitely lower than reads. And we know there we have a lot of memory amplification, so or memory throughput amplification. So maybe there's something there that is that we can improve too. Okay, so wrapping this all up, when all of this was done, we did manage to finish up on Monday, like we promised. So that was really good. And we handed the nodes back to the customer who reimaged them. And then my good friend Toby got to work on integrating all 68 of these new nodes into the cluster. And really, actually, this was pretty amazing in my mind. I don't like, this isn't an area I work in a whole lot, but basically all of those nodes were able, we integrated them into the existing cluster and moved all of the data over in under 2 weeks. And most of that time was spent just waiting as the data was moved. We used Dan's upmap remap script to do this, and it was fantastic. Basically, there was just a little bit of slowdown that the user saw in this cluster initially as we were kind of figuring out just how much data we could be moving before they saw impact. But after the first day or two, it was very, very smooth. The customers weren't really noticing any impact on the existing cluster. We were migrating data over, and in under 2 weeks, the whole cluster was migrated to the NVMe drives, and it was really, really good. I found out after the fact from them that they saw an immediate 10x performance increase with their application without any kind of real additional tuning. They basically said now it was on them to figure out how to basically increase the workload and optimize their application to make use of all of the extra performance that they got out of it. And we're expecting, based on feedback, both from them and from other customers, that we'll be probably deploying more of clusters that look like this in the future. So it was really, really fun, and it was really good. So that's it, guys. That's the presentation. Here are links to both the blog and the PDF version of this. I cover things a little differently in that, so definitely please read if you'd like. And thank you all for the claps. That's great. All right, that's it.
Nice job, Mark. That was wonderful. Round of applause to you, as you can see. Okay, so next we'd like to just move into some of the questions that popped up while you were presenting, Mark, and you can provide your guidance on these. As you all know, we're using the Q&A feature, and you've all been able to vote on some questions. So we'll start from the most popular and continue down. And if we go over time, we'll continue on, but feel free to stay as we progress. All right, Mark, are you ready for the first question?
Yes. Lay it on me.
Is there a particular marker or indicator to see if the IOMMU issue may be impacting you other than disabling it and comparing test results?
Sure. Okay. So the first indication that this was happening is that for like a large sequential read workload, we saw the far larger CPU usage than we were expecting for that kind of workload. Typically, we see for a cluster like this, for a set like this, that during large sequential reads, you have each OSD using like 2 cores or 3 cores. Those in these tests, the OSDs were using anywhere from like 6 to 12 cores to do that workload, and it was much slower than it should have been at the same time. So that was the initial indicator. The thing that really proved it was that basically attaching perf to the OSD and dumping basically a call graph from perf showed that the kernel is spending a lot of time in spin locks with IOMMU. I don't have any other better indicators that I saw than that. So really the things to look for would be that you're seeing kind of slow sequential reads. The performance seems bad. The OSDs are working really hard. That might be then the indicator to throw perf onto one of those OSDs and see if you can tell that the kernel's doing this. So that's so far the best way to figure it out that I've seen.
Awesome. Okay, next question here. Did you stick with one OSD per NVMe drive at the end of the day, even with such high capacity NVMe drives, 15.8 terabytes? And are NVMEs just good enough in processing incoming IOs and spreading them over all the memory chips they have, explaining there's no benefit in multiplying the number of OSDs per NVMe?
Sure. So what we've seen, we did stick with one OSD per NVMe. What we have seen in prior testing is that you tend not to see a whole lot of benefit in terms of IOPS or throughput. No improvement in throughput, but you don't see much benefit in terms of IOPS to doubling the number of OSDs or tripling or quadrupling or whatever number of OSDs per NVMe drive unless you have more than like 12 cores to give each OSD. In this case, we had 96 cores for 10 OSDs. So we're kind of basically getting close to where it might make sense, but in previous testing, we didn't really see any kind of IOPS advantage there. Beyond that, for this cluster, the user is using erasure coding in the file configuration rather than replication. So IOPS is kind of not really a factor anyway. Their use case is more throughput bound than IOPS or latency bound. But I will say that, especially with 3x replication, the biggest advantage to putting multiple OSDs on each NVMe drive is latency, specifically tail latency. Consistently we saw that putting multiple OSDs on each NVMe drive improves tail latency even if you're CPU bound. You do see extra CPU overhead doing this. It's probably about a 10 to 20% CPU overhead to using multiple OSDs per NVMe versus one. So there's a trade-off. If you're willing to kind of accept a reduced efficiency, then and want better tail latency, it might be worth doing. Otherwise, we tend to just stick with one. It's a simpler setup.
Awesome. All right, next question here is, which NIC drivers customer uses for Mellanox, built-in kernel MLX5 or NVIDIA OFED?
So yes, this was the built-in kernel drivers. I didn't see any evidence that we were using OFED from what I recall. I didn't look specifically no, I might have. I think I did actually look. I just don't remember off the top of my head, but I'm like 95% sure these were the kernel MLX5 drivers.
Perfect. All right, moving on down the list here, we have the next question. Did you see a performance uplift from newer versions of Ubuntu than 20.04? And there have been some AMD and UMA optimizations in recent kernels.
We did test 2204 when we were in the quagmire of trying to figure out why performance was so bad. Before we understood the IOMMU issue, we did install 2204 with whatever the default kernel is there. At that time, it didn't help, but performance was so bad already at that point that it's quite possible we didn't see any of the benefits from the newer kernel. So I guess the answer is probably we still don't really know if that would have helped in the final configuration.
Okay. All right. How were they using the Debian Ubuntu upstream packages and Ceph ADM at the same time?
Okay. So the old cluster was deployed with the Debian and Ubuntu packages. And so we just, by virtue of well, for a couple of reasons, I guess. One, because that's what they were already doing. And also because CBT doesn't use Ceph ADM. We just used the upstream Debian and Ubuntu packages for doing that testing that we did and hit that bug that we see in the upstream packages. The actual cluster, once it was upgraded, was using Ceph ADM. And that's how we deployed all of the OSDs for the real cluster in the end.
Okay, great. Next question here is, did MTU have an effect, 1500 versus 9000?
Ooh, good question. I don't think we ever tested at 1500. I believe that their network was set with 9000 at the very beginning.
All right. Okay, moving on down the list. So which kind of workloads were tested? Was it all file, block, and object?
So most of the testing was done using FIO with librd, just because we've done there's just a really huge amount of historical test results that way, and that was kind of the easiest to get a handle on what this cluster looked like. But the customer actually is using pure Rados. They are not using RBD or RGW or CephFS. Their application is pure Rados. So that was primarily what in the end they were most interested in.
Okay. What impact do you expect PCIe 5.0 NVMEs to have for Ceph, and how will they affect their purchases hardware recommendations? I might have just butchered that, but
yeah. No worries. It's all good. I butcher words all the time too. Yeah, that is an excellent question, because I think what we're going to see is that we'll be limited OSD side on CPU, especially with how fast these newer drives can be. And then also, like we were looking at earlier, memory bandwidth. We consume so much memory bandwidth right now just to hit the numbers that we're hitting at the moment that that to actually scale, and especially if we're looking at something like 400 gigabit Ethernet or something, there's going to be multiple things here that we're going to have to improve. So my best guess is that we initially aren't going to make use of them. They'll be probably similar to current Gen 4, maybe even Gen 3 drive performance, but it's quite possible that with like one NVMe drive split into multiple namespaces and multiple OSDs, you could saturate like the whole node.
all right. Next one is, would you consider using NixOS to know end to end what code is being used by every aspect of Ceph and the rest of the system? The issue discussed where RocksDB had debug flags on.
I don't know anything about NixOS, so maybe now I will, I guess, consider that. But yeah, by all means, please feel free to reach out and let me know what I'm missing.
All right. Was any test results published with encrypted OSDs, as most customers, I would think, will encrypt the OSDs if it is not ASCD?
We have not published for this cluster performance. Oh wait, did we? I might have actually, not Lux. I think I think I published the numbers for this cluster in the paper that have over-the-wire messenger encryption enabled, but not with on-disk encryption. But having said that, we have a different paper on the Ceph.io site that does look at Lux encryption performance that we did, I might have been earlier this year sometime or last year. So I can give you the link to that paper if you're interested in looking at those the performance impact of that.
Okay, great. What tooling was used to test the network for maxing out the dual 100 gig network? Were the links standalone or bonded? And can you comment on the networking config of the cluster?
Okay, so since we didn't set this up and I don't have explicit permission to talk about their configuration, I don't know how much I can say here other than to say that I think I can say that there was link aggregation. That's fine. So yes, they were bonded, but beyond that, I'll just say that that it was very, very fast. Not a problem there. We used the original iPerf to test that. iPerf 3 can be used. We looked at it a little bit, but it's actually slower for testing Cephs like this than the original iPerf is. So iPerf, multiple parallel threads of execution. Yeah, hit the full 200 gig E very, very easily. And even multi node tests look really good too.
Okay, so the next question is a follow-up from an earlier question here. Have you had an opportunity to compare performance between RHEL-ish 9 versus Ubuntu 22.04 deploys?
Sure. No, we haven't. So the upstream lab actually needs to be upgraded to CentOS 9. Right now it's on CentOS 8 CentOS 8 stream. So yeah, it's actually a little long in the tooth, and that's probably a spring project here is to get that upgraded. Having said that, once the issues with the Debian packages were fixed, this cluster generally looked like it was performing at the same scale relatively comparably to the upstream CentOS setup. There are enough variables there in terms of the hardware and everything that it's not an exact Ubuntu versus CentOS comparison, right? The only way you could really do that is to run it on the exact same hardware. But the gist of it is it didn't look like crazy different. So take it for what it's worth, I guess.
Okay. Any idea on the difference in performance between 8 and 12 drives per NVMe host?
So it will depend on the exact NVMe drives, I believe. And it will depend on how much CPU you've got. If you are not CPU limited, if you really have enough CPU to drive all 12 drives, and if you've got really, really fast NVMe, or sorry, if the NVMe drives are slower drives, you'd probably see an improvement going from 8 to 12. But a lot of times we see that that things like the 4K random read IOPS tend to be limited per host to around 600 to 700,000, kind of like I mentioned earlier. So if you can hit that with 8, I doubt you're probably going to get a lot of benefit going up to 12. You might get some, but probably not a ton. But in other cases, like for sequential reads and sequential writes, if you really have the network bandwidth to pull it off, you might still scale going up from 8 to 12. I would say, though, that you're probably already hitting diminishing returns past 8 for just about anything. Just a guess, but that's kind of what I've seen in the past.
All right. Was IOMMU disabled in the kernel or BIOS?
That was disabled, if I remember right. In the end, they decided to disable it as a boot parameter to the kernel. I believe we had the option to do both, and they just, for their own reasons, decided that that would be easier for them to do it as a boot parameter when booting up the nodes.
All right, a few questions left here. Next one is 192 gigabyte memory seems low compared to the rest of the hardware spec. Wouldn't more memory help to improve read performance, Cash?
Great question. So maybe. The next jump up is to go to 384 gigabytes of memory, which it does increase the cost of the system. It maybe would be worth it if you are expecting to have a lot of O nodes. So in Ceph, usually the best performance gain you can ever have is to make sure that O nodes are always cached. And if you have a lot of very, very small objects, or if you have a lot of object fragmentation into multiple extents so that O nodes use more memory, and especially if you have a very, very large active data set size, then potentially you might want to increase the memory like this to make sure that O nodes stay in memory. Their use case did not really match any of this. They're doing larger objects, pure Rados objects. They're not necessarily breaking those down a lot. I don't maybe want to get too much more into this, but the gist of it is that for their particular use case, it wasn't really necessary to bump the memory up anymore. They're still, I think we're running at like 10 to 12 gigabytes per OSD, which is not terrible. So like you might see that there's a general recommendation for like 1 gigabyte of memory per 1 terabyte of disk space. My personal feeling on that one is that it's kind of right when you're talking about like in the middle realm of like 8 terabytes for 8 gigabytes of memory for 8 terabytes of space. Yeah, it's fine. It doesn't really work when you're at very, very small scale or very large scale. You don't really need like 30 gigabytes of memory for a 30 terabyte drive. You also can't get away with 1 gigabyte of memory for 1 terabyte of space on the drive. That kind of rule of thumb is not always quite right.
Okay. What is the performance difference between a raw NVMe device versus an OSD managed device in regards to percentage loss or performance per drive?
Oh, that is such a detailed question that it would take me forever to get into it here. But so the one thing I will say on this is that make sure that, especially if you're testing like small random write performance, that you're really testing like with FIO using fdatasync, the fdatasync flag or at least the fsync flag. The NVMe drives tend to perform very, very differently when you're actually looking at committing data to the drive versus when you're allowing it to just kind of like stream stuff through. This is very true, especially if you look at consumer grade drives without power loss protection, but it's even true for drives that have power loss protection. You will see loss with Ceph for sure. CPU usage, especially if you're CPU bound, you absolutely will be. But it's not quite. A lot of times when people try to do comparisons like this, they're not quite doing it in a way that is realistic, I guess. Yeah. I know that's a very vague answer, but it's the best one I can give you in such a short amount of time, I think.
All right. Next one was using Mellanox cards over Broadcom an intentional choice? Do you find they perform differently with Ceph?
We have a lot of experience with Mellanox cards. We know they work really well. Broadcom cards, I have heard some good things about them recently, and I've been meaning to try to get my hands on a couple of their higher end ones just to try them out. I know a couple of people have said that they actually like Broadcom cards significantly more than like Intel cards, and we've actually had okay luck in our lab with Intel cards, so I don't feel like strongly about that. Yeah, I've heard from people that the more recent Broadcom cards are a reasonable option as well. So right now we stick with the NVIDIA cards just because we know them really well, but or Mellanox, but yeah, that's not I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to other ones as well.
Okay, 2 more questions, Mark. You're doing great. So would you make disabling IOMMU a general recommendation, whatever the cluster architecture or hardware, or is this only NVMe drive relevant?
That is a great question. So up until we worked on this cluster, we had never seen this issue present. Upstream lab, this on older Rome-based nodes from Dell as well. Basically, the previous generation of this node never showed any signs that this needed to be done at all. The customer did say that they have hit this in other contexts. I think specifically around networking with their application. So potentially this could affect things outside of Ceph. I don't have any experience with it myself, but it definitely seems like on newer gen processors, on Genoa processors, it's probably worth paying close attention to. I don't know if it's specific to Dell. It might be specific to Dell, and maybe other vendors don't have this. I'm hoping to test some Supermicro gear coming up, newer Supermicro gear, and look into this. But yeah, we don't know. We'll see.
Okay. And did you adjust the OSD memory target to something higher than the default?
I believe we're running with like 10 or 12, but I don't actually remember what the final setup ended up being. For the testing purposes, all this testing, it was set at 8.
Okay. And one last question just came in. What, if any, Linux level tuning was performed?
Okay. So the customer had their own network tuning that they did, and it was very close to the same tuning that we use in the upstream performance lab. Basically, fairly standard looking 100 gig tuning. Like if you go to es.net, they give you some of this kind of stuff as increasing a bunch of the buffer sizes, and there's some other random things that they mention in there, but nothing super exotic. Like I said, we did restrict C state transitions. I had done that using TuneDadmin for a while. That's basically just setting the TuneDadmin profile to network latency. But in the end, they actually decided, because we were seeing some additional benefit, to, in the BIOS, just set the performance mode to maximum performance, which is a Dell specific thing. It disables C-state transitions, and also I think maybe tends to keep the frequency higher. But I don't remember all the details of what it does. That alone was good enough. It didn't matter what the TuneD profile was after that. If you set that, they're also running their fans at maximum speed now, all the time to help keep those machines cool. That dropped the max temperature of the processors down from about 95 degrees Celsius down to like 72 or 73.
All right. Well, that concludes our questions here. I appreciate everyone who asked and participated. Mark, you are a wealth of knowledge, and so we all greatly appreciate you sharing this with us. You did an excellent job. And just a friendly reminder to everyone, you can expect a follow-up email from me that'll provide some resources from this presentation. And if you have any further follow-up questions for Mark or about Clyso, please feel free to reach out. And we will be back at this next quarter. So everyone have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, everyone.